Hi, my name is Christina Leslie, and this is my exhibit, Pinhole Portraits and Places at Stephen Bulger Gallery.
The exhibit is comprised of 3 different series: Pinhole Remix, Pinhole Places, and Pinhole Parishes. A pinhole camera is simply a lensless box that captures the images using just a tiny hole. Light enters through the pinhole and projects an inverted image onto photo paper inside, and it's grounded in the same principles that you see in a camera obscura. A camera obscura was a darkened room or box that projects a scene from outside. Artists used to use the obscura to help with their perspectives. To get a paper positive from a pinhole negative, you would have to do this in the darkroom. You would place the negative paper face down on fresh photo paper, and then you expose it briefly to light. After developing and fixing, then you are left with a positive image, essentially what we would call a contact print. In 2017, I became really interested in transforming my digital camera into a pinhole camera. After a lot of trial and error, I figured out how to successfully convert it. I was interested in making portraiture specifically of Black subjects. For me, this work was about addressing gaps in the history of photography, especially like early archives, where I felt that Black presence and Black bodies were often missing or erased. This series kind of became a way of me pushing it back against that absence, and I was inspired by the lighting that I would see in classical paintings. There were a lot of paintings where I saw patrons of the arts being painted with these angelical halos around them, or there was this dramatic contrast where one side of the face was illuminated while the other was faded into the shadow. So that became the aesthetic that I wanted to employ these portraitures. So over time, I had photographed over 20 different people, but what you see here in this exhibit is a smaller selection. So Pinhole Places was a continuation of my exploration with the pinhole camera, but this time I pushed it a step further. I was really inspired by the work of Barth, who focuses not so much on traditional photographic subjects, but on the act of looking itself. Her images often capture light and subtle shifts in everyday spaces, and it's less about what we see, but more about how we see. And I think this really resonated with me. And so I wanted to tap into that sensibility. So I began making pinhole lenses for my camera using found materials with wherever I could source from the places that I was traveling to. And altogether, I've created over 400 images, but of course, we're only showing a handful here for this exhibit. These 2 images, for example, were shot in Miami. I knew that during the day, Ocean Drive would be packed with people, and so I decided I would go back around 3 a.m. when it was quiet and more contemplative, and I could be more intentional with what I was seeing and capturing. And I was also really interested in light painting. So you see this one image, Colony. I used my cell phone to get also these long streaks. So these are also very long exposures. And I think this series altogether, when you take the entirety of the collection of Pinhole Places, this series really does play with perception and challenging our ideas of place and recognition. I think some of the scenes might feel very familiar, while others might be abstract or unplaceable. And I think this tension is what's really important to me. I think that pinhole aesthetic naturally lends itself to this ambiguity, and I also think it connects back to photography's early history. And again, I'm using whatever materials on hand specific to that location to build the lenses. So the tools themselves shape this idea of place. Pinhole Parishes is the most recent chapter in my ongoing exploration with the pinhole camera. This series is deeply personal. It's rooted in my dad's memories and my family's history in Jamaica. Growing up, my father and my relatives would often speak fondly of the late 60s. They did kind of describe this time as very vibrant and informative, and it was because Jamaica had just gained independence. So I think there was this big cultural boom that was happening. Music was flourishing. I think it was just an exciting time. But what struck me through all of this is that none of their moments that they've ever described to me were ever documented. They were never photographed. And that absence, again, has really stayed with me. So I began thinking, what would it mean to create the fictional archive, which kind of brings me back to what I was doing with the pinhole portraits. to use my camera not just to document, but to imagine and honor these lost moments. So, in a way, I'm acting as this custodian trying to bridge that gap. I was also really influenced by my mother's photographic history. She's born the same year as my father, but she's raised in Canada. And so, unlike him, she had access to photography from a very young age. And so, when I looked at her photos from the late 60s, early 70s, I noticed like there's this distinct aesthetic. There's a lot of faded greens and yellows, but I wanted to use that color palette shape the tone of this series. And so, as I've gone back to Jamaica, rather than focusing only on sites that are specific to my dad, I decided I would mix them with my own travels and his memories. So it's this multi generational project. Jamaica, it's made up of 14 parishes, and the goal is to photograph each one of them. And so with each visit, I've used found materials, whatever I can source locally, to build a new pinhole lens. Again, I'm grounding the project back physically to the reality of place. And so far, I've photographed 6 parishes, and I plan to keep eventually capturing all 14. It's interesting because I think what's moving about this particular body of work, it resonates with people beyond Jamaica. People from different parts of the world have said these images remind them of their own family albums and memories. So I think that response has been really great to hear, which makes me feel like I'm on the right path and that this project is something worth developing and exploring further.